Welcome, GEMA members, to our next installment of the GEMA Talks vidcast series. I'm very pleased today to introduce Alex Marquardt. Alex is a senior national security correspondent with CNN. So today we're going to delve deep into the TV news industry, and he'll be able to share, a really unique perspective on how the news industry is covering the coronavirus pandemic, and I think it, equally as important, how the news industry is presenting and producing, and as an on-air reporter like he is, how they're presenting and producing the news during this shelter-at-home world that we live in. So I want to say hello to Alex Marquardt. Welcome, Alex.
Rich, so good to be with you and with all GEMA members. It's fantastic. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for finding the time. I know your news life is quite hectic right now, so I really appreciate you finding the time to do this during this crazy world we live in.
Yeah, it's pretty busy. It's a strange time when we're talking about quarantine and people getting stir crazy and cabin fever, and at the same time the world obviously keeps spinning and there's so much going on here in DC and all around the world. So it's balancing those has been strange.
I bet. Why don't you first start by helping the audience just explain a little more what your role entails as a senior national security correspondent at CNN. What does that actually mean in terms of?
It's a good, because it's kind of a catch-all beat. When you look at the beats in Washington for any news organization, primarily they're centered around buildings, whether it's the White House, the State Department, the Pentagon, Congress. And so what national security does is it kind of steals a sliver of each of those beats. So I'll deal with the Foreign and Intel committees on Capitol Hill. I'll talk to the National Security Council at the White House. I'll deal with the State Department on certain issues, all the while not trying to step on the toes of our other beat reporters. So it can be a blessing, it can be a curse. One of the best ways to do journalism is to be on site and be in those buildings. So sometimes it's tougher for me because I don't necessarily have a building, but also I do enjoy how I do get to do all these different things. I'm sure we'll get into it. I was a foreign correspondent for a long time. And so part of my goal in coming back to the States and in taking this beat was to kind of do what I was doing before, but from the American policy side of things. So, I was based in Russia, I was based in the Middle East. Now I'm dealing with a lot of those things, but from the US policy side of things, from the intelligence community's perspective, from the State Department's perspective. So it is quite kind of all encompassing. A lot of what I've been focusing on, I got to DC right before the midterm elections in 2018. So I've been focusing on election security, both for those elections and for 2020. I've been dealing, as I mentioned, a lot with the intelligence community. And then, of course, because of my background, I try to keep a toe in the Middle East, in Russia, and then obviously with China being such a huge adversary and rival for the United States these days on a number of different fronts, particularly now in the age of COVID-19, that's also a big part of my portfolio as well.
And as I mentioned, needless to say, the coronavirus epidemic has dramatically impacted the news industry in terms of how you produce news every day and present the news. How has it specifically impacted your job?
Well, behind the scenes, it has been very similar to what I used to do. And in front of the camera, it's been very different. So the biggest change for me in coming back to the States and joining CNN, and I should say I was at ABC News as a foreign correspondent for 8 years. And out there, you're sort of by yourself with your small team. You're not used to working in a big office building, in a big bureau. So that was kind of the biggest change in coming back to the US and frankly, putting on a suit most days and working in a big studio with lots of lights and hair and makeup down the hall. So behind the scenes, this quarantine life has been very similar because I wake up in my own home. I work in my own home. I don't have the bosses, keeping tabs on me. But then, and this happened yesterday, I had 3 different live shots. All right, they call you got to be live in 10 or 15 minutes. Normally, I would run to what we call a flash studio, so just a small room with a camera in it in the CNN headquarters here in DC, and go live. Instead, I had to grab a light from the closet. I had to put the chair down. I had to dial up my what we call an IFB, my earpiece on one phone, use my other phone as the camera. So doing it all yourself, so then, that kind of distracts you from focusing on what you're about to say, what you're about to talk about, the editorial of the subject matter. And that's just one frenzied example. I mean, at the best of times when you're set up and ready to go, it's just odd to do live shots in your bedroom, which is what I'm doing now. Right. And I think that has kind of been fun to some extent for the audience to get a little bit of, to see inside people's homes. Yeah. That's created that spawned, Twitter accounts and all sorts of comments online about people's homes. But it's, you miss the camaraderie of being around other people, bouncing ideas off of other people. Now we're all on Slack instead of being, I can't walk out into the bullpen kind of thing and just talk to people, and come up with ideas and exchange information on, so much of what I do is source-based. I deal with a lot of people who don't want to they don't want to be seen telling me things, that anonymous sources, high-level security sources. They don't want to be texting. They don't necessarily want to be on the phone. And so a lot of what I was doing before was going around town, having coffees, having lunches, having drinks, to not just get to know these people, but to get information. And that has basically dried up.
That's interesting.
I'm not able to progress as much on that front. I mean, there was a time when I'm out every other night or every single night having source meetings. Right. And obviously you can't do that anymore. And you certainly can't do it in the same way on Zoom or on the phone.
No, that's a really interesting point I hadn't even thought of. And then just technically speaking, does CNN provide you with like a in-home studio kit of some kind, or just for our audience, what you're using?
The technology these days is obviously pretty good and pretty cheap. So I got a new computer rather, right before all this hit. So we go live two ways, either through the Cisco WebEx platform on our computers, so I'm on my computer right now. But primarily what I've been using is an app on my phone called LiveView. Okay. LiveView, for those not in the industry, is something that we use all the time normally. Gone are the days of live satellite trucks, mainly. I mean, they're still out there, but primarily these days we've got these backpacks with a bunch of SIM cards in them, and you can go live in HD quality, and it's fantastic. So they also have an app called just the LiveView app. So I put that on a tripod, and then I've got a ring light, which I'm actually using right now as well, which gives you a decent amount of light. I plug in a little what we call lavalier microphone into the phone. And then, as I mentioned, I've got a separate phone with my earpiece in it. On that one, I dial up what we call the IFB line, which is I'll hear the programming, I'll hear the anchor in my ear, and then just talk normally. And one of the things that we've been really pleasantly surprised with is the audience doesn't seem to mind the difference in quality. I think obviously there are a lot of people who are very forgiving in this moment. They understand why we're all at home. It would be strange to see, say, a White House correspondent going live, not from the White House, but at home. But for the kinds of things that I'm talking about, it's okay. And frankly, it looks good. By and large, they have given us the equipment to make sure that in these not ideal situations, not ideal time, that we're able to do the best we can.
And have you exclusively been reporting from home, or have you actually ventured out at all?
Both. So I've been out in the field, and so as this.
What dictates that when you do go out in the field?
It's both the bosses assigning me a story and me pitching stories, and as the coronavirus story picked up, and I don't mean to sound callous and make it sound like a story, but this is as I approach it, it is CNN. If you've been watching, it's a public health story, it's an economic story, it's a person story, as it should be. I mean, we're talking about the health impacts on the country, the economic impacts, and how this is impacting people on an individual level. It's not as much a national security story. It is to some extent. We can talk about that if you want, trying to figure out where the virus came from, that kind of thing. But I have my entire career told people stories. And so what I've tried to do is to come up with ways to cover what's going on in this region. Not trying to travel too far. You know, people, including myself, aren't too eager to get on a plane and fly off into the middle of the country or down south. And so I've been tracking what's been going on in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, in Pennsylvania area. So I have been out in the field, you know, leaving my national security beat briefly to go and just do, you know, regional stories. So for example, I went to Philadelphia for a couple of days. The White House Coronavirus Task Force had said that they were going to be a hot spot. I went up there, and normally you would travel with your team. You would generally be at least a 3-person team. So correspondent, producer, camera person. In this case, producers stayed home and virtually produced, coordinated everything on Slack and via phone and text. I drove myself separately from my cameraman. And the entire time he was there, we were together. We stayed away from each other. We wore masks and gloves. We took all the precautions. And it was great to get in the field because for me, it's just nice to have variety. But it was eerie. And in this case, for example, we were staying in a hotel in Philly that was completely empty. No one else was staying there, it seemed. There was no food or bar service. It was strange. But it was, you know, it was great to get out in the field and to tell the side of the story from there. So I've done the stuff at home, and done the stuff in the field. And I've always liked to just have a healthy balance of both.
Do you think there are any new ways of producing or presenting the news that have arisen from this situation that you think may remain, or is there going to be a new normal? Or do you say, you know what, Rich, once there's a vaccine, a year goes by, I think everything, you know, goes exactly back to the way it was?
There's definitely going to be a new normal. There's definitely going to be a realignment.
And what are the ways that will manifest itself?
Yeah, this was already a trend. I mean, I joined CNN for the first time in 2007, and I was a one-man band with my own camera, you know, computer. I was able to broadcast by myself. So that trend of basically of slimming down the package that you needed to get on the air had already been happening. And now I think we're realizing again and teaching ourselves again that we can do a lot of these things without sort of all the accoutrement and luxuries that have normally accompanied live television broadcasting. You know, what I was touching on earlier about the sort of forgiveness from the audience in terms of the shot, you know, I think when things get back to normal, quote unquote, yes, the bosses would like myself and other correspondents to be back in front of real HD cameras. But I think for guests, certainly, you're going to see a lot more of this kind of thing at home rather than in studio. Right. You'll probably see perhaps smaller sets or you know, less of these massive productions. Yeah. You might. I think there's probably an understanding going on, and this is all just me speculating, that, you know, perhaps you don't need to be in the office every single day, that you can get stuff done at home. You know, it's that you know, you don't have to have everyone in right. all the time. So right. we're understanding new things about what the audience likes and expects. We're understanding new things about what people can do themselves and what kind of technology they need. And then there's certainly a thinking that's going on about what the other side of this will look like in terms of the physical presence of the different types of teams in the bureaus, whether it's the news gathering desk, as we call it, the editors, the correspondents, where they should be, the operations people, the cameramen, where they should be. So there's definitely a lot of thinking that's going on. None of this is settled, but there's no way that things look the same on the other side as they did before. Yeah.
I wonder if there'll be less, I don't know if it's much for reporters like you who are on air, but I wonder if there'll be less, just generally less travel. You know, will companies say, yeah, you know, I need to fly to Spain for that conference, but you know what, maybe we'll stay here and do a remote hit from it, or it'd be what you said, which is the one piece of your job that does seem to be challenged right now is the ability to do sourcing as you said, people aren't jumping on a phone to necessarily tell you something secretive. They're going to be more willing
Yeah.
to do that in a dark corner alley somewhere outside. So I think that's the other side of it, I guess, too.
I hope you're wrong. I don't think you'll find a single reporter who says, I hope there's less travel. I think if that does arise, that's going to be because of financial considerations.
Right.
There's just no substitute for getting in front of someone, for sitting down with them, whether they're an interview subject, a source, going to a conference. It makes all the difference in the world. That already was a consideration before, across the industry as these news budgets shrink. It's, what can we do? Can we do if I need to interview someone in Russia, can I just send a crew there?
Yeah.
And then I do the interview over the phone and it looks like I was actually there. That hasn't happened, but it's just a hypothetical. But so that those kinds of considerations were already in effect. And I imagine that probably will happen. Already around the world, you look at the presence of foreign bureaus for every major news organization. There are fewer and fewer every year. So that was already shrinking, and you have to imagine that given the way that the economy is going to look, that will certainly be more of a consideration. But again, from a reporter's perspective, no, you want to get on that flight. You want to meet those people in person.
Yeah. You've referenced your past part of your career where you've been stationed internationally and have just like unbelievable travel and unbelievable work you've done around the globe. I think it'd be really interesting for everyone to hear how you got into the news business originally. You were in the Foreign Service at Georgetown. Were you at Georgetown saying, my goal in life is to be an international news reporter, or did you have other pursuits?
No, not at all. In fact, I envy the kids who grew up saying, I want to be Walter Cronkite and Tom Brokaw, who had those aspirations. Not at all. I'm an American who grew up in Europe. I have American parents. They still live in Europe. And so I grew up kind of straddling the Atlantic and having American and European sensibilities. So I always knew I had an interest in the world.
You went to high school in Europe.
I went to high school in Brussels. I did my first year of college in Switzerland before transferring to Georgetown.
Okay.
And ended up doing a full 4 years at Georgetown because I really loved it. And wanted to be in the School of Foreign Service. And frankly, my dad's in finance. Most of the people I grew up exposed to in terms of adults and parents were not in media or journalists. So I kind of thought that I might go into finance as well. And I don't need to tell you, there are a lot of people at Georgetown who also think that, and the banks recruit pretty heavily. And I did start interviewing for them my senior year. But sophomore year, right before 9/11, I joined GUTV, which is the campus TV station. And then 9/11 hit, and for whatever reason, I was kind of like a producer director on a show whose the name's escaping me. But anyway, we did sort of, where were you when type things around 9/11, the reaction to 9/11.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed working, doing everything. I mean, there were so few of us. It was like a jack of all trades type role. And I kind of rose up through the ranks within the station and ended up running programming, I think, by my senior year. But then someone in the year above me had gone on to what is called the Page program at NBC, which is a terrific training ground for anyone who's interested in the media. Could not recommend it more. If anybody's seen 30 Rock, Kenneth the Page, somewhat accurate depiction of what that job actually is. So when the finance thing didn't work out, I moved to New York and ended up getting a job at the Page program, which could not have been more fun. So my best friends to this day are from that program. And back then it was kind of the rise of, we were kind of on the cusp of that traditional path of like going to a small local station, going to a medium station, going to a large station.
Right. That was sort of the one path. Yeah.
Right. Or trying to rise up within a company, which was becoming possible. And so I actually had my eyes on a network called Channel One News, which was for high school networks. It used to be based in LA. Sadly, they closed up shop about a year and a half ago. And that's where Anderson Cooper started and Lisa Ling started. And so I aggressively pursued them and ended up getting a job with them here in DC. They moved the operation to DC. That only lasted a year before they picked up and went to New York, but then I got picked up by CNN as what they called an embed, and that again was kind of a jack of all trades role. I was a young producer, 26 years old, in 2007, for what looked like the biggest election of our lifetimes. It was Obama, it was Hillary, then running against McCain, Romney, Huckabee on the other side, and that was my journalism school. That was such a terrific training ground to see these massive campaigns up close. I mean, to walk into an arena with Barack Obama, it was like being with the Rolling Stones. And I did it 5 times a day for months. It was just extraordinary. And ended up finishing up the campaign with Joe Biden, and was in Grant Park the night that they won the election. But I knew the entire time, and I think my friends who were with me on the trail would tell you the same thing. Like I knew that I needed to go overseas. I knew that that's where I wanted to be. I had gotten such a great training from CNN, and ABC had an opening in Russia, and ABC had been kicked out of Russia for insulting Putin a couple years prior. And so one of the deals that ABC struck with the Putin regime is that they would have a correspondent in Moscow, unlike other networks. And when I say networks, I mean the big ones: ABC, NBC, CBS, not CNN, which has always had a correspondent there. And so I moved to Russia, and I joked that it was one of the most boring periods in Russian history, because that was when Medvedev was president and Putin was prime minister, and he was actually fairly quiet. There was the restart with the Obama administration. So everything was pretty peaceful between the US and Russia. It's hard to imagine now. There wasn't a ton going on. And I was actually born in the Middle East, and I knew that I wanted to get to the Middle East at some point. And about just over a year since I got to Russia, after I got to Russia, they offered me the Jerusalem Post. And I thought, fantastic, dying to get out there. I'll move out there, and I'll cover Israeli-Palestinian stories for a couple of years. But I got there in January 2011. The Tunisian revolution was in full swing, and everyone was kind of looking around saying, wait, what's going on in Tunisia? Do we care what's happening in Tunisia? Ben Ali, the leader, fell on January 14th, and then 9 days later, I was in Egypt, because we'd started hearing rumblings about what was happening in Egypt. Sure enough, revolution kicks off there. I did that. I did the revolution in Egypt, went to Libya as they started, went to Syria as they started. And so it just launched about 6-7 years of nonstop travel around the region, covering the wars, the conflicts, the uprisings, but also the fallout, the massive refugee crisis that emanated from that, traveling to Jordan, to Lebanon, to Turkey. And then, of course, the migrant and refugee crisis started moving up into Europe. And so I started spending more time in Europe. And keep in mind, at the same time, the Arab Spring started dying out. Sisi came to power in Egypt. Assad started winning more and more, thanks to Iran and Russia, in Syria. And it became harder and harder to get into Syria. And I had been sneaking into northern Syria and doing stories on the rebels. And then, of course, with the rise of ISIS, that became more and more difficult. A number of journalists, including some friends of mine, were killed by ISIS. And the story kind of moved into Europe with more and more ISIS attacks in Europe, the migrant and refugee crisis crossing the Mediterranean. So I spent time on the Med, on rescue ships, and all across Europe doing refugee stories. And then Trump got elected. And frankly, I never thought I would come back to the States. I was very happy as a foreign correspondent. And then I got a call from CNN from an old friend who I'd known from my ABC days, and he said, "What do you think about coming back to the States and being a domestic correspondent?" And I said, "I hadn't thought about it, but Trump is the biggest story in the world." And so here we are. And that was first in New York, and then I realized all the action was in DC. So I'm back in DC now 20 years after I first arrived for Georgetown.
Amazing. Wow, so many questions about everything you said, but I guess
wasn't too long.
No, it's great. I think one of the first questions is, what do you think are, to be an international correspondent and to live that life and report in that way, what do you think are some of the 2 or 3 keys to success in that role? What does it take?
Well, Yeah, a number of things, two or three at least. I mean, obviously there's a passion and interest and a curiosity about the world. Um, World's a big place. If you have a specific interest, that's really going to help. I knew that I wanted to get to the Middle East. That was always a goal. So, you know, if you're a student now, for example, brushing up on the culture, the history, the languages of a place that you might want to be. You know, if you don't know where you want to go, that's fine. So certainly a willingness and a desire to travel around the world. One of my biggest regrets at Georgetown is not focusing on the languages that would eventually be helpful to me. If I could go back and do it all over again, the most important thing that I could have drawn from my Georgetown experience was some level of fluency in Russian or Arabic. I mean, that I really should have done that. I studied Italian, beautiful language, totally useless. I mean, that's not totally fair. I've done some stories in Italy where it came in handy, but
not as useful as
not as useful. Lovely language. I'm really glad I speak it, but I really should have focused on Arabic primarily. You need an understanding that it's not going to be easy. These jobs are few and far between. If you're going to go out there, you know, a lot of times you're probably going to be a freelancer and you got to be a hustler. That's hard. It's low pay. It's hard to find those gigs. I mentioned the shrinking news budgets all over the world and particularly overseas for foreign coverage when it comes to American news organizations. So, you know, there are times to go overseas and there are times not. I mean, the Arab Spring created this incredible opportunity for young journalists. I remember being at parties in Cairo and looking around and everyone was in their 20s. I mean, you had staff correspondents for both print and TV. You had young freelancers. I mean, everyone was in the story of their lives, you know, as young people who didn't have responsibilities and didn't really have to, you know, take care of families and that kind of thing. So it can be a grind. It can be a hustle. I mean, right now, going out and being a foreign correspondent would be very difficult for an American news organization. American outlets are entirely focused on what's going on in the country. You know, obviously with an exception for what's going on around the world when it comes to coronavirus. But so there's an ebb and a flow. I'm hoping that, you know, that we will revert back at some point to a real interest in what's going on in the world. And I'm confident we will. And hopefully the budgets will follow that. But I would really say, you know, focus on what you might think is an area that you would be interested in, learn as much about that area as you can, go there. There are going to be outlets, whether it's a local newspaper, wire services, radio, you know, you can always cobble together some strings to put together, you know, hopefully enough to live on. And, you know, the major news outlets will continue to cover those areas.
Yeah. Given the various roles and the various countries you lived in or reported on, or continents, I should say, what stories or stand out for you that you've covered that either you're most proud of or that impacted you the most across your job?
I think the Egyptian Revolution will really stand out as sort of my first big foreign one. I mean, I was 29. I hadn't really been thrust into a major international story yet, and this was it was seismic. It was a once in a generation story, and once in this entire country trying to cast off the chains of a dictatorship. It was just remarkable and inspiring, and I spent so much time there during the revolution and in the years that followed. Anytime there was a flare up, I was living in Israel at the time, and I would fly there. And then it was Syria. When Syria started up in March of 2011, and of course here we are just past March of 2020, 9 years on, it's still going on. Right. You know, I crossed into Syria from the north a number of times, and then I've been to Damascus a number of times, and so that story is something that is just unbelievable and incredibly sad what has happened to that country, which is, I can't say enough good things about the country. It is just such a remarkable nation in so many ways, and to see it torn up like that is just absolutely devastating. So that's been a really important story for me. And then I think the third would be Gaza. You know, I lived in Tel Aviv, I worked in Jerusalem, spent a lot of time in the West Bank and Gaza, and I covered both the wars in 2012 and 2014 with Hamas against Israel. And it was some of the most difficult scenes that I've seen, some of the most trying days from both emotional and professional standpoints. Some of the most rewarding, getting to work with some incredible people at ABC News to get those stories on the air. And it was very difficult, but very rewarding at the same time, particularly the 2014 war, which dragged on for more than 50 days. It was just, those three are really going to be the ones that just will stick with me forever.
Yeah. What was the hardest part about being an international correspondent?
I would say on an emotional level, sort of seeing it's rarely good news, frankly. I mean, if we're going somewhere, chances are something bad has happened. I mean, I've done a number of stories that are happy and fun. I mean, one of my last ones for ABC News was about lemurs in Madagascar. I mean, that kind of thing's great. But by and large, what you're doing is covering bad news. And that takes an emotional toll. When you are, you know, if you're in Gaza and you're just showing up to a scene where a building has just collapsed from an Israeli rocket and, you know, a family's been killed kind of thing. And, you know, the screaming, the wailing, the chaos, the smells, the noise, it's, that kind of thing is hard to shake. And, you know, that goes for Syria and other places as well. I think it's really it's the personal loss. It's the sort of the darker side of war that is really the hardest part. I think some people would tell you that, you know, living away from your friends and family is difficult, and that's true, and that's a big reason that I came back to the States.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you're having the adventure of your life, and you're
Right.
making such great friends out there that, you know, I never gave it a second thought. But you know, there are a number of foreign correspondents who, you know, after a long time covering a certain story that is really hard and heavy, will say, "All right, I gotta move on. I gotta go do something else." And then there are those who don't, who are very attached to the story.
Yeah. Yeah. As you look out into the future and with the beat that you cover, what do you think over the next, you know, I don't know, say 1 to 3 years 1 to 5 years will be the most important sort of national security issues for the United States?
Well, we've got a couple big ones right now, and keep in mind this is 2020, so even if coronavirus is happening, we've got a huge election on our hands. So until this hit, I was starting to focus more and more on the election in terms of cybersecurity, election security, less so from like a voting machine standpoint, and more like, what are the Russians up to? What are the Chinese and Iranians up to? What do they want to do to mess with our elections? So that's going to be huge, and that's going to continue. And a lot of what I've been doing on coronavirus coverage has had to do with the cyber side of things. I mean, China and Russia are sowing disinformation. China is hacking into hospitals to steal information, to try to steal research on vaccines. So the coronavirus has created a huge national security element that kind of dovetails with what we're already doing in election security, and that's going to continue. I mean, we've never seen anything like this when it comes to cyber meddling. That's going to continue in a massive way. Yesterday, we're taping this on May 1st, we saw the president essentially butt heads again with his intelligence community over evidence of where this coronavirus came from in China. And that is something else that is going to be a major national security story, is the stability and the strength of American governmental institutions in the age of Trump and after the age of Trump. You know, can the Defense Department, can the intelligence community, can the State Department continue to operate in a way that where they're really being tested at this moment. I mean, it is very strange and rare to see an American president speak out essentially against the intelligence community. So how do those apparatuses continue to do their work, or how are they reformed? I mean, we've got a national security advisor, a guy named Robert O'Brien, who is completely reshaping the National Security Council, slimming it way down in a way that, say, Joe Biden were to be elected, would take a long time to build back up if he wanted to.
Right.
And then the third big one I will say is, what is America's role in the world going forward? We have seen a shrinking of the American presence around the world. That's very much by design. And Trump talks about America first. Pulling out of a number of international accords. We're seeing far less reliance on the U.S. by the Europeans and others. So will the U.S., if Biden is to be elected, will the U.S. re-engage? Will the U.S. be able to take back its place in the world? If Trump is reelected, what does that mean for all of the other things that I've talked about, whether it's the institutions or pulling back from the world? So it's really those on a micro level. It's dealing with the immediacy of coronavirus and the election and how we get through that from a national security perspective. It's the strength of the institutions within the national security apparatus. And then the biggest, most macro thing is the role of the U.S. in the world. And all of these questions have been thrown into doubt, which journalistically makes it fascinating to cover. As a citizen, it can be troubling.
Yeah. I'm hoping we'll have some Georgetown students listening in to this vidcast and this conversation. And you touched on a few things in terms of advice, but for someone who's actually in college or about to graduate college, I'm going to ask a separate question about how do you get a job in an internship right now, given the craziness of the crisis we're in. But just on an overall basis, what do you tell someone who's in college who thinks they do want to do what you do for a living? What are some of the key things for them to do?
Yeah, I'll tell you now, my answer to that second question won't be as good as the answer to this first one.
I had a feeling.
If we weren't living during a global pandemic,
Right.
What I would say without question is to do what I did and try to get as much journalistic experience as you can on campus. Georgetown has some terrific media outlets, certainly in its papers. And from what I understand, there are far more opportunities in terms of video than there were when I was there. And then you live in one of the biggest media cities in the world. I mean, there are incredible opportunities in Washington, D.C. to intern with any of a number of news organizations. And I hate to keep sounding old, but that didn't exist when I was around. I mean, you've got the legacy organizations, you've got the new online organizations. So get off of campus, get an internship. They're all out there. I think more and more of them are paid. I'm pretty sure CNNs are paid. And then try to parlay that into a job. The biggest piece of advice that I give young people is all you need to do is get your foot in the door. Like, just get your foot in the door. Yep. And then you can work your way up. If CNN offers you a job working in the library, take it. I mean, it's not about the job, it's about the exposure. Right. And it's about meeting those people. And those people are going to help you get the next job. And, have your eye on the prize down the line, absolutely. Right. But you want to get in the door. And don't be afraid to jump around and try different places. So do what you can on campus. Try to get an internship. Talk to as many people as possible. That's another thing that I didn't do enough of. Identify people like me and others in the industry. And there's a very, very strong journalistic community, which Rich will tell you about and can help you with, who you can reach out to, who will be more than willing to give you advice on how to proceed.
Yeah. No, I always mention that point about getting the foot in the door, because sometimes I think younger people, they're looking for this perfect job, or boy, I went to Georgetown, so unless I'm doing these things, it's not worthy of me. And I say, I don't want to oversimplify it, but sometimes that's the hardest part, is getting in. Once you get in, if you're talented and work hard and have a passion for it, you can move up, as you said, and you can get where you want to get. So it's right. So let's now pivot a little to the issue that we have today. do you think this will in any way change the ability for younger people to get into the business, or will there be a challenge in that regard?
In the short term, yes.
Yeah.
Hopefully not in the long term. The internships, as you can imagine, are moving online, from what I've heard. And so
CNN is even doing internships.
yeah, they are. CNN, you should definitely check out the jobs website on CNN.
Mhm.
Very easy to find. I know that there are a number of departments that are doing internships, but they're going to be virtual.
Right.
I have to imagine, and I'm just speculating here. I have to imagine that the number of posts has gone down. It's obviously far harder to contribute from home if you've never worked in the building. I mean, I'm not allowed into the building. They're not going to let interns into the building. So
Mhm.
I think the opportunities are still there. I imagine they're far fewer than they would be otherwise. I know that there are going to be some delays in terms of people who already have jobs onboarding and getting started. That's been
Right.
kicked down the road.
Right.
So, we are blessed, I think, and I'm speaking for my own network, that we're going to be pretty resilient. I think we're at the end of the day, we're going to be fine. And so hopefully in the longer run, things will even out, and the opportunities will still be there. There's going to be a little disruption right now. It's going to be harder to get an internship. If you've already got a job, it might be delayed a little bit.
Mhm.
Obviously, the hope would be that by next summer, or you'd say the spring or the fall, we're already, Georgetown, I think, doesn't even know whether they're going to have students on campus in the fall.
They haven't announced that yet, right?
So you have to imagine that the companies at the same time don't know whether they're going to have internships. But let's just say that things are getting back to normal in 2021, and that's certainly the expectation of the city of Washington and Mayor Bowser, that those internships will be back. Those opportunities will be back for people who are graduating in 2021. CNN, for example, I'm just going to plug my network for a second, has been great at hiring young Georgetown students. I can name a whole list of students who graduated in the last 2 or 3 years who are doing phenomenal things. I was an embed on Biden in 2008. The current embed on Biden in 2020 is a young woman named Sarah Muha, who I think graduated in 2017. So we're ready and willing and eager to take Georgetown students. We just need to get society into a place where that kind of thing is possible.
Yeah. We also should not say goodbye without mentioning that the viewership and consumption of the news networks, including CNN, have not surprisingly been huge during this. So it's been obviously a bizarre time in terms of such a crisis, but at the same time, people are obviously, because they're at home, they're relying on people like you and CNN and all the other networks to report what's happening around the U.S. and the world. So that's an important thing to note, that the industry, and obviously from a revenue standpoint, I know there's some challenges, but from a news consumption standpoint, you're thriving right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not on the business side, so I can't really speak to that. And I know that none of the news organizations really want to come out and say our viewership, our readership is better than ever. There is obviously an extraordinary amount of interest. And it's not just because people are sitting at home, it's because people are being impacted directly. And that's why I say, we are addressing this as a health story, an economic story, because this is what is impacting people. Rich, I got to the Middle East and I said to my producer, I'm amazed, this was in Egypt during the revolution. I was amazed by how many Egyptians were just crowded around the TVs watching news all the time. And I said to my producer, like, this wouldn't happen in the States. Like, people might tune in for, at 6:30 and watch the evening news.
Or for a debate, one of the debates or something.
Right. And so my producer, Nasser, said to me, it's because it impacts their lives. What you're seeing on TV is impacting them directly. And I think that that's what we're seeing now, in more peaceful times and quieter times. There's a lower viewership because people might feel disconnected from the stories that are on the air. Now they feel incredibly connected to what's going on. They want to know the latest. This is a story that is changing hour by hour, day by day. May 1st, again, you got a bunch of states that are opening up. People want to know what that means for their states, for their cities, for the country. So yes, there's an incredible interest in what's going on. And we certainly not to sound magnanimous about this, but we certainly do appreciate that people are looking to us. It does feel like a service,
Right.
and we are keenly aware of the responsibility we have to make sure people are getting the information they need.
Good. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. So, Alex, again, thanks so much. This is enlightening. And again, it's such an interesting way to get a sneak peek at someone who's really on the front lines of reporting and creating news reports during this time. So really, thank you. And I know you probably have to get back to work. So
thanks so much for having me. It's really been good. Since getting back to DC, I've been doing what I can to get back involved with the Georgetown community. I've been a fan of yours for a long time, a fan of GEMA's for a long time. You guys do some terrific stuff. I would say to you and to everybody out there, draw on those of us who are Georgetown journalists. We are eager to help out and bring up the next generation of journalists from Georgetown. So by all means, do reach out. Thanks so much for having me.
That's terrific. Thank you, Alex.
Take care.
Yeah.